It should be very easy to appreciate everything that we have here in the West. We aren't persecuted by our own government, we don't face any serious external dangers, and we aren't forcibly sent to prison for questioning the government. This is something that we all just kind of take for granted. But let's not forget that this hasn't always been the case. At different phases in history, there are times when you are forced to convert to a specific religion that maybe you didn't really care for. There are other times when you got drafted to fight and die in a war that you know is absolutely pointless and has nothing to do with you or your life. And finally, there was one specific point in history when the government was so powerful, so corrupt, and so driven by revenge and hatred that it unleashed an unspeakable terror upon its own people. This government was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was the worst man-made catastrophe to ever happen to the human species. And I don't say that lightly. Not only did they unleash absolute terror upon their own people, but they spread communism across the world, resulting in the deaths of 100 million people. The Soviet Union was the worst man-made catastrophe to ever happen to the human species. And I don't say that lightly. Not only did they unleash absolute terror upon their own people, but they spread communism across the world, resulting in the deaths of 100 million people. And that doesn't even take into account all the people that were driven to drunkenness, depression, insanity. Those 100 million people had friends, families, lovers. What happens to all the people that knew someone in that pile of corpses? The best way we can honor the memory of those 100 million poor, innocent human beings is by understanding their plight and learning from the mistakes of the Soviet Union. The best way to do that is with the life and work of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. You see, when communism was first taking off in Russia, Solzhenitsyn completely bought into it. He was a communist. He was one of them. When World War II came around, he allowed his soldiers to commit war crimes against innocent girls and women in Germany. But when he had even a small criticism of Soviet leadership, he was sent to the gulag. And after many years of misery and misfortune, he saw the error in his ways. He turned away from this hateful ideology and became one of the most influential figures in dismantling the Soviet Union. His books showed the world what was really going on in this socialist utopia. The Life of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Hello there, Eric Alden here. I would very much appreciate it if you followed the podcast, maybe even followed me on social media. All of the links to that will be on the website in the show notes. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the show. Solzhenitsyn came from very humble beginnings. His father died before he was born, and it left his mother to raise him all by herself. Now, luckily for Solzhenitsyn, his mother was an intellectual. She encouraged him to pursue higher education and raised him in the Russian Orthodox Church. He was born in 1918. Not everywhere in the world is a horrible place to be in 1918. But one place you definitely don't want to be is Russia. Or even a neighboring country for that matter. The Russian Civil War had somewhere between 7 and 12 million casualties. It's regarded by many to have been the most catastrophic national disaster in European history, not least because it resulted in the establishment of the Soviet Union. Now imagine being a small child while all of that is going on, and as he becomes an adult, he grows up in this Soviet system, where no one is allowed to question the government, and everything you learn in academia or the media is heavily slanted towards state-sponsored communism. Solzhenitsyn basically lived his entire life throughout the USSR. The interesting thing you have to keep in mind is the fact that Solzhenitsyn considered himself an ally of the regime up until the time he gets sentenced to the gulag, which wouldn't come for some time. He actually had a very nice early life. He did really well in high school, went on to pursue mathematics and physics in university. He also spent many of his hours of his free time writing novels and stories, which he started to get really good at. But his life gets interrupted by something. That something was World War II. By the time 1942 comes around, he's training to be an artillery commander. In most cases, someone like Solzhenitsyn wouldn't have been required to serve in the military, but because the Soviet Union was so caught off guard by the Nazi invasion, they needed anyone they could get, even if that meant sending intellectuals to die in the front lines. Solzhenitsyn is very honest with the fact that he was a staunch communist at this point and not a very good person. He wrote a lot about his leadership in the Red Army, where he was actually an officer. He had absolutely no problem getting extra food while some of the lower-ranking people didn't get any. He also didn't mind being disrespectful or rude to his subordinates because he knew that they really couldn't say anything to him. And if they did, they were off to the gulag or on a suicide mission in a lot of cases. He had absolutely no problems with the regime, the way it was set up, the way the power structures were. He didn't question it for a second. Like many other Russians living under the Soviet Union, he viewed the communists as liberators and as the bringers of a new age. They were going to deliver the common people to a new egalitarian utopia. During his time as an artillery officer, he witnessed some of the worst war crime atrocities ever committed in human history. That was the Soviet rape and torture of German civilians in their march to Berlin toward the end of World War II. The Red Army tried to justify their own actions by telling themselves that they were seeking revenge on Germany for what had been done to Russians. Solzhenitsyn actually wrote a poem about these atrocities committed by the Red Army called Prussian Nights. Quote, "The little daughters on the mattress, dead. How many have been on it? A platoon, a company perhaps? A girl's been turned into a woman turned into a corpse. It's all come down to simple phrases. Do not forget, do not forgive, blood for blood, a tooth for a tooth." End quote. Now, what absolutely breaks my heart about a situation like this is remembering that this is the average person versus the average person. Whatever German families that this happened to probably had nothing to do with the Third Reich and quite likely resisted Nazi control. Quite a few heroic ones did, especially Christians. If you sit back and really think about it, these boys in the Red Army had been drafted to fight a brutal war against their own will and then got fed continuous hate propaganda against the Germans. So by the time they get into Germany, they actually see themselves as doing these war crimes, as justifying things or making things right. And that's how government turns innocent, ordinary people into bad guys. Because once you've done something like this, you've crossed the line. There's no redemption after you rape innocent civilians in wartime. These atrocities were particularly horrific because it happened with almost no resistance. Almost every fighting-age male in Germany had just been killed, and the Western Allies were too busy stealing German scientists to concern themselves with the atrocities committed on civilians. It's interesting too because local German communists had long awaited the day the Red Army would come and liberate them from Nazi rule. One German communist wrote, quote, "Men and women from the working population say to us over and over again, we had so hoped that it would become better. We were so happy that the Red Army was coming, and now they are behaving just like the SS and the NSDAP always told us they would. We cannot understand this." End quote. As is often the case in being liberated by a communist. Solzhenitsyn, like many other officers in the Red Army, essentially turned a blind eye to what was going on here. He disliked what was going on and strongly condemned it personally, but he wasn't about to make the abuse of someone else's citizens a primary issue in his life. While in Eastern Prussia, Solzhenitsyn had written to an old school friend about the conduct of the Red Army during World War II. He had some criticisms of Soviet leadership, namely commands that came from Joseph Stalin. Now, what happened was Solzhenitsyn and his unit were completely surrounded by Nazis. This was the result of poor leadership and terrible tactics. Solzhenitsyn did an amazing job as an officer and led his men out of that position, taking only a few casualties. He wrote to his school friend that the reason he was in that situation to begin with was because of the poor leadership, and in the typical Soviet way, his letters had been screened and he was sentenced to 8 years in the gulag. Now, we get to the part where someone who was once a staunch and devout communist, who fought ferociously in the Red Army no less, gets a taste of the bad side of the regime he so fervently supported. Quote, "The universe has as many different centers as there are living beings in it. Each of us is a center of the universe, and that universe is shattered when they hiss at you. You're under arrest." End quote. Being under arrest by the Soviet Union was one of the most uniquely cruel things that could ever happen to you as a human being, especially as a political prisoner. Solzhenitsyn had a very difficult experience in the gulag, partly because he was going to experience firsthand what the ideology he believed in so thoroughly had created. Secondly, he wasn't going to get the opportunity to celebrate the victory in the war he had just fought in. While everyone in Russia was celebrating victory over Nazi Germany, Solzhenitsyn was suffering alone in a cell. Quote, "Above the muzzle of our window, and from all the other cells of the Lubyanka, and from all the windows of the Moscow prisons, we too, former prisoners of war and former frontline soldiers, watched the Moscow heavens, patterned with fireworks and crisscrossed with the beams of searchlights. There was no rejoicing in our cells, and no hugs and no kisses for us. That victory was not ours." End quote. There were two classes of people who were sent to the gulag. The first kind was your typical prisoner, someone who was a thief, or a murderer, or a rapist, the kind of person you'd expect to be locked up. These people had some leniency granted toward them. They weren't viewed as outright criminals the way other prisoners were. The Soviet regime argued that these prisoners were victims of oppression from the previous regime, and the reason they were raping and stealing from and murdering people was the fault of reactionary elements. In short, the real criminals were treated quite decently, actually. Then, there were the political prisoners. You were a political prisoner if you had any connection to the Tsar, ever criticized communism, had any affiliation with any kind of other political school of thought. Even the Menshevik communists were sent to the gulag. That's how extreme it was. Even if you were a more middle-of-the-road communist, you didn't fit the state-sponsored idea of right think. You were in the Bolshevik revolutionary camp, or you were in the death camp. There was no in-between. Quote, "All those who had burglarized apartments, stolen the clothes off passers-by, raped girls, corrupted minors, given consumers short weight, played the hoodlum, disfigured the defenseless, been want-only destructive in forests and waterways, committed bigamy, practiced blackmail or extortion, taken bribes, swindled, slandered, written false denunciations, peddled narcotics, pimped or forced women into prostitution, whose carelessness or ignorance had resulted in the loss of life, all went scot-free." End quote. All of those people that were just listed off went scot-free, or rewarded, or compensated for their oppression by reactionary elements. I think personally, This is the biggest injustice that took place. Not punishing people who truly deserve it based off an unrealistic and ideologically warped view of the world. The Soviet system somehow came to turn every natural human idea on its head. The complete opposite of what is right. It really brings to mind George Orwell's idea on the matter. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. And keep in mind, George Orwell is someone who leans to the left. He even voluntarily fought in the Spanish Civil War alongside communists. If anyone wanted a socialist state to be a success, it was him. And then he got a chance to see what was really going on in the Soviet Union, the Socialist Utopia. Many of the harshest criticisms of the Soviet Union came from people you'd think would have some sympathies. Everything from economics to civil disputes and justice were completely reversed and opposite of what you would think they would be. Have you ever heard that old Russian joke, what happens in Russia? In America you make money, in Russia money makes you. I think something like that really sheds a lot of light on this situation. Because when you begin to contrast Western liberal democracies with what was going on here, the difference becomes astounding. There are some passages that I read from the Gulag Archipelago that I just don't even know what to say about them. This is some of the most shocking material I have ever read. Every time you think you understand what happened in Soviet Russia, you read something like that and realize it was much worse than you have ever imagined. Now, we all know the Tsarist regime was oppressive, corrupt, and backwards. It had serious problems, and that's how we got into this whole situation to begin with. But if you really want an idea of how terrible the Gulag was, you have to compare the difference between the Tsarist prison and the Gulag. I mean, here you had a repressive, autocratic regime with an absolute king. I mean, literally, divine right of kings. That was official policy with the Tsar. You'd think he would have had worse prisons than the political movement that grew in a response to his repressions, wouldn't you? No, that wasn't the case at all. Dostoevsky, the great Russian writer, was forced into a labor camp under the Tsarist regime. He wrote about his experience, and it was very apparent that it was not hard labor. Life in the exile camps during the Tsarist regime was actually quite bearable. Before he published anything he wrote about the life in the camps, it had been censored by the Tsarist regime for making the camps appear to be too tolerable. The Tsar wanted people to fear being sent away to the camp. He was making it look too easy. So they essentially forced Dostoevsky to exaggerate his own experience in the work camp. That's how easy it was under the Tsar. Writers literally had to exaggerate their own suffering in work camps. The opposite was the case under the Soviet Gulag. If a prisoner or former prisoner wrote about how terrible the gulags were, they were sent right back in. Speaking the truth was a crime, and in speaking the truth, you made yourself a candidate to be sent back to the freezing cold of Siberia, laboring for 12 hours a day. Starvation, isolation, the worst prison system in the history of humanity inflicted upon you again. And so you can imagine why so many people decided not to write about the Gulag. That's why someone like Solzhenitsyn should be praised for his bravery. He risked that to tell his story, and the stories of countless others. And I think what really makes Solzhenitsyn's effort so worthwhile is the simple fact that most of his effort is directed at telling other people's stories. He very well knew that if he didn't tell these stories, no one was going to. And all of these people he suffered alongside would have been lost to history. At one point, he tells the story of a man named Dr. Zubov. Him and his wife hid a deserter in their home, protecting him from being sent to the Gulag. Because if you deserted in the Red Army, you were sent to the Gulag. Later on, this same deserter turned them in. Both Mr. and Mrs. Zubov received a 10-year gulag sentence. But what was really interesting was the Soviet court's decision on the matter. The court determined that their guilt lay not so much in hiding a deserter, but in their absence of any self-serving motive for this concealment. What do you mean you did something nice for another human being? That's 10 years of misery and suffering, Zubov. And then the worst part about this situation was that the prisoner who turned the Zubovs in, that deserter, was released from the gulag under Stalin's amnesty after only 3 years of serving. The deserter who turned in the very people who protected him was able to carry on his life. The Zubovs were not. That's Soviet justice for you, isn't it? Another really important idea that we have to hit on in this episode is the capability of human beings to do such terrible things to one another. Human abuse and the torture that took place in the gulags, as well as across all of Russia during communist rule, was some of the worst of what human beings are capable of. The worst side of many people came out. Their demons were revealed. But the reason they were able to carry out such terrible acts against their fellow man was the simple fact of dogma and conformity. Communism became the common man's ideology in Russia, and it provided justification for all of the evils they were doing. Without this justification, these horrible atrocities would never have taken place. It may be difficult to bring yourself to do these things on your own accord. Think about how many people become the type to just kidnap random strangers and torture them. It doesn't really happen. There are very few people that actually do this, and understandably so. They don't have an ideology to justify their actions. At least, not easy access to one, that is. Now, all of a sudden you introduce the concept that you're torturing and murdering these people to bring about utopia. And now you have an idea that people can really get behind. And it's especially scary because it worked. Or, as Solzhenitsyn put it, quote, ideology, that is what gives evil doing its alongside justification and gives the evil the word, the necessary steadfastness and determination. That is the social theory which helps to make his act seem good instead of bad in his own and others' eyes, so that he won't hear reproaches and curses, but will receive praise and honors. Thanks to ideology, the 20th century was fated to experience evildoing on a scale calculated in the millions. This cannot be denied, nor passed over, nor suppressed. End quote. I think of the ideologies as something of a blueprint. Hatred and violence will always be present in every human being, but without a conscious plan of action. These things will just occasionally slip out. Once in a while you have someone that goes on a murderous rampage or attacks some number of people. It's only when you have an ideology that you can organize thousands of people in collective violence. And it's 1,000 times more destructive. Think about it. Even the worst serial killer in the history of mankind can only kill so many people. But an effective ideology has the potential to kill hundreds of millions. And with access to nuclear weapons in the modern age, perhaps the potential to kill everyone. And when you belong to one of these ideologies, you don't take kindly to anyone that has any kind of criticism toward that ideology. And what you really have to admire about Solzhenitsyn is the fact that he came up with the idea that would destroy this evil. That idea is truth. Quote, let your credo be this. Let the lie come into the world. Let it even triumph, but not through me. End quote. Personal responsibility and a strong, healthy relationship with truth is the only thing that can stop any evil, whether that evil be a form of government, ideology, or something else entirely. And something else that's really important to point out is how many millions of people simply allow this to happen. It's one thing for bad people to lose it and go crazy. That's just going to happen from time to time. It's part of human nature. But what really gets me is the fact that so many people sat idly by as people that should have been in the insane asylum started running the state. Quote, even in the fever of epidemic arrests, when people leaving for work said farewell to their families every day because they could not be certain they would return at night. Even then, almost no one tried to run away, and only in rare cases did people commit suicide. And that was exactly what was required. A submissive sheep is a find for a wolf. End quote. And I've always wished that I could have had some kind of time machine to go back and ask people what they were thinking about these events as they were unfolding. That would be interesting, wouldn't it? Because you could get to understand why people tolerated this kind of behavior in the first place. Now, getting back to Solzhenitsyn, one of the biggest changes for him was when his very first book was published. Now, keep in mind, this was years after he had been released from the gulag, so there was always at risk of being sent back. This book was A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. It's important for a couple of reasons. For one, this day in the life was a day in the life of a gulag prisoner, and it's significant for Solzhenitsyn because it was a day in his life in the gulag prison system. Solzhenitsyn is Ivan Denisovich. I could probably spend an entire hour just talking about this one book. It's very good. But if you wanted to get down to it, one of the most important elements of this book that also explains quite a lot about Solzhenitsyn, you have to understand the main character's relationship with his cap. Weird, right? But it makes a lot of sense. Here's why. For one, the main character's cap is important to him. It symbolizes civility and manners and morality, something that was severely lacking in the Soviet gulag, especially because the guards did everything they could to create division between the prisoners. You get a little bit more bread if you ratted out someone plotting to escape, things like that. Also, there was a great deal of dehumanization going on. You were no longer referred to by your name, but by your number. And this is something that is very typical in concentration camps or gulags done by anyone. The Nazis did it too. Because what dehumanization allows the guards to do is to emotionally separate themselves from these inmates. It makes it a lot easier to be cruel and torturous to someone you view as a number or an enemy of the state. There were quite a few inmates who actually got caught up in trying to find favor with their sadistic overlords. They viewed that as the only way to get back to living life, but this was no way to cope in the gulag. Ivan wanted to do everything he could to maintain his sanity and survive the gulag without losing his humanity. There were a couple of ways he did this, but the most important was that he always took off this cap before he started to eat. Now, really quickly, I just want to point out that Ivan Denisovich is referred to as Sukov in the book. Just know that when I say Sukov, I really mean Ivan Denisovich, who is symbolically Solzhenitsyn. Quote, Sukov took his cap off his shaved head, however cold it was. He would never eat with it on. He stirred up the cold gruel and took a quick look to see what was in his bowl. It was the usual thing. End quote. Maintaining just a little bit of civility was enough to keep Ivan from going mad. You can bet your rear end that Solzhenitsyn used this exact tactic during his stay in the gulag to help himself get through it. And by doing this, it did something for him psychologically, and it gave him control over his own mind and stopped himself from completely breaking down as a human being as so many other prisoners had done. You could even make a case that someone like Solzhenitsyn thrived in the gulag. Quote, you should rejoice that you're in prison. Here, you have time to think about your soul. End quote. Most of us find ourselves being completely lost in the world, but when you're forcibly put into a position where you have absolutely nothing to do but work, labor, and reflect, you find yourself exploring your own mind in a way that is extremely difficult and beneficial. You know how they say truck drivers are extremely intelligent because they're left alone with their own thoughts for long periods of time? It's something like that. The effect is the same, but only more so with the gulag, because you have to not only master the demons within your own mind, but also endure the demons running the gulag. Solzhenitsyn was a rare kind of man, because he undergoes this kind of transformation while he's going through this tremendous amount of suffering. He goes from, albeit a pretty crappy person, to someone of the highest moral standing and wisdom a society can produce. If for no other reason than being able to survive and still have a fulfilling life after being subjected to the horrors of the gulag, his outlook on life and happiness changed drastically, but it made him stronger and much more formidable of a human being for it. Quote, "Satiety depends not at all on how much we eat, but on how we eat. It's the same with happiness, the very same. Happiness doesn't depend on how many external blessings we snatch from life. It depends only on our attitude toward them. There's a saying about it in the Taoist ethic. Whoever is capable of contentment will always be satisfied." End quote. And in theory, it really is that easy. Change how much you need to be content, to be satisfied with life, and you'll be able to withstand any amount of suffering. If someone could go through the Soviet prison system and find a way to be content with life, then us with our smartphones and junk food and expensive electronics should be able to find contentness in our lives too. Now, none of the books he released were ever published until years after he had been out of the gulag, and the crazy thing about it is that he almost died right after he got out. Solzhenitsyn had cancer. 1953. It really looked like he was not going to make it. By 1954, the Soviet government permitted his treatment in a hospital in South Kazakhstan. His experiences in the hospital formed the story of Cancer Ward, which is another great work by him. You should definitely check it out. Luckily for him and the world, his cancer went into remission and he lived to publish all of these world-shattering books. Sometimes you have to sit back and wonder what would have happened had that cancer killed him. Would the Soviet regime still be in place today? And when you really think about it, it puts into perspective how big an impact one human being here on the world can have. And the way he became popular in the world is very coincidental, and there's a lot of luck behind him. Nikita Khrushchev was responsible for Solzhenitsyn publishing One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. The book was instantaneously a hit. People in Russia loved it, and people all over the world read it. And this first book really did two major things. Number one, it exposed the communist system for what it really was, and made Solzhenitsyn internationally famous. And being famous would come in handy later on when Khrushchev dies. Because without Khrushchev's protection, the Soviets would have loved to kill Solzhenitsyn. He was ruining the good Soviet name after all. Now, his international reputation may have been what saved him from being outright murdered. But it did not save him from endless harassment from the Soviet government. On countless occasions, he had to write and hide different manuscripts because there was always the risk that a KGB agent would raid his apartment and confiscate everything. He had countless manuscripts hidden all across Russia and even in other countries with friends. Unfortunately, this only lasted for a few years. Eventually, the Soviet regime just thought it would be better to get rid of him altogether. This meant him being expelled from the country. And he would live out a couple years in Switzerland and West Germany, but where he spent the majority of these next few years was the United States. There, he was able to continue his work, writing and teaching, with an emphasis on what happened in Russia. He was extremely influential on Western thought and continues to be to this very day, as he should be. He was largely responsible for a lot of anti-communist thought coming from the US, especially at this time. There were quite a few times where US politicians talked to him about what it was like living under communism, and sometimes this meant big-name politicians like Ronald Reagan. Solzhenitsyn had a big impact on the West, but that didn't stop him from having his criticisms. And I think that's something that a lot of Westerners ignore about him. He was extremely anti-communist, but it didn't stop him from being openly suspicious of what was going on right here, because we had and still have many integral problems. And I'm just going to be honest with you, I think a lot of his criticisms of American and Western culture are particularly true. For one, he noted the significant decrease in courage. People no longer stood willing to die for their ideals. In fact, Americans are not really willing to die for anything anymore. All we want to do is live longer so we can consume more goods. Materialism has swept across our culture the worst it has ever done to any people in the history of mankind. How exactly you go about fixing a problem like that, I'm not exactly sure, but it's important to acknowledge it's a problem. Another problem that he noted was the lack of religiosity. People were and still are turning away from the church. The church whose principles and ideals built the civilization that we live in. Now, Solzhenitsyn also had an interesting observation about religion and its role in Russia. Quote, "Over half a century ago, while I was still a child, I recall hearing a number of old people offer the following explanation for the great disasters that had befallen Russia. Men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. Since then, I have spent well nigh 50 years working on the history of our revolution. In the process, I have read hundreds of books, collected hundreds of personal testimonies, and have already contributed 8 volumes of my own toward the effort of clearing away the rubble left by that upheaval. But if I were asked today to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of the ruinous revolution that swallowed up 60 million of our people, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened." End quote. That really puts things into perspective now, doesn't it? He believed that the number one thing that led to the terrible Soviet system that killed tens of millions of Russians and over 100 million people worldwide was the loss of God. And when you really think about it, it makes a lot of sense. In communism, there is nothing in life but class struggle. Whatever class you're in, you are a soldier of that class against every other class of human beings. But with religion, particularly Christianity, there's something more than the material struggle of the world. People have motivation and incentive to behave well to their fellow human beings, for the sake of being good, and for the sake of being granted a spot in heaven. When you take away the ideology that encourages people to be good for the sake of being good, what do you have left? Why wouldn't you just have a bunch of classes of people fighting for resources, wealth, and power? That cynical view of the world offered by Karl Marx really becomes true when you turn away from God. And I think the strongest distinction between political good and religious good is in the actual effect. With Christianity, you have a personal incentive to be a good person. You alone are responsible for your own actions, and your interpretation of the scriptures shapes what it really means to be a good person. But with politically enforced ideas of being good, such as with communism, all the goodness is theoretical in nature, because in reality, an ideology like communism really boils down to an ends justifies the means type of situation. That means if you kill 100 million people to achieve the communist utopia, then it was a good and justified action, if it can actually get you there. There is no personal responsibility in communism, only the responsibility to the collective and to further the proletariat revolution. If you do some horrible thing, then as long as you can justify it in terms of advancing the revolution, you're good. That is the distinction between Christianity and communism. If a Christian were to murder people in the case of advancing Christianity, this would be seen as a negative and unchristian. And whenever this has happened in the past, it has been denounced. Whereas with communism, even the worst acts of communism gets respect from other communists abroad. And after all the years of suffering and reflection and with the personal experience of the Soviet regime, the following paragraph sums up the major lessons Solzhenitsyn learned throughout this great struggle. Quote, "Gradually, it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart, and through all human hearts. This line shifts. Inside us, it oscillates with the years, and even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained, and even in the best of all hearts, there remains an unuprooted small corner of evil." End quote. Solzhenitsyn dedicated the entirety of his adult life trying to warn people of the dangers of communism. He saw firsthand what happens to ordinary people and how human nature is exploited and taken advantage of under communism. It's a horrible and tragic thing to watch it happen to your people, your friends, your family. It's something I couldn't imagine, and something I hope you and I never have to see. There's a really good line to wrap it all up. Quote, "The communist system is a disease, a plague that has been spreading across the earth for many years already, and it is impossible to predict what peoples will yet be forced to experience this disease firsthand. My people, the Russians, have been suffering from it for 60 years already. They long to be healed." End quote. And the good news is that the Soviet Union did fall in 1991. Even more so, Solzhenitsyn got to live to see it happen, even had a chance to give some practical advice to Russian politicians like Vladimir Putin for how to de-Sovietize the nation. This episode is particularly special because Solzhenitsyn's life is the greatest story of personal redemption I've ever heard. I mean, sit back and really think about it for a minute. You have someone that was completely indoctrinated into a hateful ideology that discovered the truth, and then dedicated his life to fighting against that tyrannical ideology. And even in the most extreme of circumstances, he was able to find happiness. Quote, "A man is happy so long as he chooses to be happy, and nothing can stop him." End quote. And that was the life of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Hey everyone, Eric Alden here. I really hope you enjoyed that show. If you did, feel free to leave a rating, maybe a review. There are a bunch of big projects in the works right now. I'm currently working on 2 short documentaries, a long-form episode series for the Dark History podcast, and there are always more Biocast episodes being made. The best way to keep up with everything is to sign up to the email list. Emails don't go out very often. It's only on a special occasion when a big project drops that you'll receive an email. You can find that at ourdarkhistory.com. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you again soon. Peace out.